Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Open Access Pilots, Learnings from Elsevier and Pilot Partners, which is sponsored by. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials, which will be brief because today's webinar is a panel discussion. And we're using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our presenters. We do expect many questions, and we likely will not have time to get to all of them, so we apologize in advance for that. But that being said, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. So please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also note that we're recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we're ready to get started. So I'll pass things over to Lana.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Lana Ware. I'm our moderator today, and I'm Business Development Director for Open Science Solutions at Elsevier. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with our customers in the Americas to develop, implement, and partner on our open access agreements in the region. And first, I would like to take a moment to thank our panelists, not only for taking the time to join us today, but also for your ongoing partnership. You have undoubtedly been part of helping to inform our understanding of customer needs and improving our systems for authors and agreement administrators worldwide. So thank you very much. Especially given the extraordinary last couple of years we've all just experienced, we thought we'd just take the opportunity today to share how we've been working with North America customers recently. We've really found that needs and goals of customers vary widely in the region. So we've been focusing in on really understanding those unique needs and how we can best support our individual customers. One such example is open access, which was an important requirement for all of our panelists and the institutions they represent. So today we'll share some information about how we at Elsevier are approaching open access, but also how our customers are approaching it and how we're working collectively to help support their goals and to learn together. So with that, I'd like to hand this over to our panelists to introduce themselves. We do have one Elsevier representative, and the rest are customers with whom we have an open access pilot in place. There will be representatives from San Jose State University, one of the California State University campuses, as well as the University of Florida and Carnegie Mellon University. So panelists, please feel free to share your name, institution, position, and anything else important by way of introduction. If we go alphabetically, Emily, if you would please get us started.
Thank you, Lana. My name is Emily Chan. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Scholarship at San Jose State University. San Jose State is one of the campuses within the 23 campus California State University Consortium. I serve as an administrator for the Open Access Pilot with the CSU.
Thanks so much, Emily. Gemma?
I'm Gemma Hirsch. I'm Senior Vice President for Global Research Solutions. I look after the team that works very closely with our customers on open access and open science agreements. And I'm also Senior Vice President for our academic and government customers in Europe. That's where most of our open access transformative agreements are based.
Judith?
I'm Judy Russell. I'm the Dean of University Libraries at the University of Florida. And we have been pursuing a number of different types of open access agreements, but the one with Elsevier was one of the first we did, and certainly the first with a large publisher. So we've been very pleased to share some information about that with you today.
Thanks so much, Judy. And Keith?
I'm Keith Webster. I'm Dean of University Libraries at Carnegie Mellon University. Like UF, we are pursuing a number of open access agreements of different flavors, shapes, and sizes. Elsevier was our first and one that we were very happy to develop.
Thank you all very much. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in. Today, all of our panelists have had slightly different experiences with their pilots and have been involved in slightly different ways. So I have prepared questions keeping that in mind. I also do have questions that are directed at the panel as a whole, but panelists, please do know that you're welcome to add to each other's comments and speak up at any time. We are very eager to hear all of your unique perspectives. And also for our webinar attendees, we're eager for you to participate and ask questions as well. So as Sabrina indicated, please do feel free to type those in the Q&A function. And at the end of our discussion, I'll pose audience questions to the panel. Gemma, I'd love to start with you to give a little background about open access and the global perspective from your role. Could you please touch a bit on open access around the world and how we're currently approaching agreements with customers?
Sure, thanks, Lana. And as maybe my intro indicated, and so does the question, I'm approaching this both from a global perspective with my global research solutions hat on, and also the regional perspective, working in North, South, and Central Europe, where open access is most advanced globally and where most of our transformative agreements are from Elsevier's perspective. I'd say that broadly speaking, we observe three types of customer groups. There are those customers that are focused on budget, particularly post-pandemic, but also longer-term budget pressures that many institutions are facing. There are those that are focused on open access, and then a small but growing group that are focused on open science, the future beyond open access, I guess. And layered on top of those three groups is also a regional view. Open access being most pronounced and advanced in Europe, North America, Asia Pacific, slightly further behind, and I mean that from a share of subscription versus OA article perspective. And instead, much more focused, I think it's fair to say, on budget, especially in North America. It's what we hear from our customers time and again. Whereas we have in APAC, Middle East, Africa, much more of a focus on research impact and showcasing research performance. And these different layers and different perspectives globally, of course, they're generalized, but they hopefully help put Elsevier's approach to open access in perspective. The more we engage with customers on this and other topics, the more I think it really reinforces to us the uniqueness of each institution's needs and goals. And that often means that we're developing and co-creating quite tailored or customized solutions to meet these needs. In short, as the adage goes, one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's certainly true of the North America market. And that's really why we've put an emphasis on individual customers working to forge a path forward in whatever direction our customers want to go. And for those that do have open access high on their agenda, we're very keen to work to support them on that journey while achieving fair value for all. And we have about 20 open access agreements globally with varied OA components, testing and learning different elements. And to give you a flavor of some of these, I'm sure we'll talk about them in more detail later on, but we have agreements with big diverse consortia, very big centralized consortia, individual institutions. We have customers who are looking to achieve a full transition in a very, very short time frame. For others, success is doubling their open access versus where they are today. We have customers who want to directly influence author behavior in a very proactive way. Others who feel much less comfortable with this approach and want our workflow to look different. And those who simply want to learn more about how their authors perceive open access to inform their institutional strategy. So lots of different perspectives and things that we're learning. It's also worth noting briefly that our support for open access does extend beyond our customer agreements. So nearly all of our journals offer an open access option. We've also successfully launched over 500 fully gold journals because we really want to have that focus on ensuring all authors can publish open access across disciplines and across quality tiers. Our OA article volume growth between 2019 and 2020 was 65%, quite extraordinary growth numbers there, making us one of the fastest growing OA publishers as well. So in summary, I think what we found is that partnership and collaboration are key components to successful development, I think, of most things, but in particular in the open access space. We're eager to support the needs of our customers and serve as partners where OA is one of those needs. I'm really trying to move the conversation from being a zero-sum game, which I think it's been in the past, to one where we can focus on partnerships, win-win solutions, addressing challenges together.
Thank you so much, Gemma. It's definitely an exciting space to be in. Judy, I'd love to start with you from the customer perspective. I have a bit of a two-part question for you. First, I'd love to hear a bit more about open access at the University of Florida. So for example, how stakeholders on campus are approaching OA, researcher perspectives, and how the library is engaging with the topic. And second, building off of that understanding of the open access landscape at UF, were there certain learnings in particular that you were hoping to glean from the pilot?
Thank you, Lana. Yeah, I think open access has been important at UF, but in maybe a more subtle way than in some other institutions. Analytically, we've got about 27% of the 8,000 articles a year that our authors publish, where they are an open access article, and that doesn't mean it's the corresponding author. It's often an author in a co-authored paper where the corresponding author may even be at another institution. So there's a lot of participation in open access, but it hasn't been a value that has driven the university, I would say. It's there, it's strong. We wanted to do more to encourage it. We certainly wanted to strengthen our relationship with our authors and our support for them. Our authors choose Elsevier over all other publication families, if you will, substantially. It's year over year, the highest volume of articles are in Elsevier journals. They then fall off to Wiley and Springer, and then fall off significantly from there to a very wide range of other journal families, because we're a very comprehensive university. So logically, we wanted to come to Elsevier as a preferred publication source for our authors. And I was very pleased to approach Elsevier with my own concept of what kind of an OA agreement would work for UF. And actually incredibly impressed with the land speed record that Elsevier set, because I approached them at ALA midwinter in 2020. We had a proposal back to us in March. We had an addenda to our master agreement by May, and the program started in July of 2020. So we're just about completing 18 months in the pilot. And it's one that does not eliminate APCs. Our scale of publishing with Elsevier was way too large for us to be able to do that, but it does reduce the APCs. And we also had committed to doing research with our authors as a part of our agreement and sharing that research with Elsevier. And we found it a very beneficial process. It has, as we hoped, put us in much more direct communication with many of our authors. And we've been very pleased with the administrative support that's been provided by Elsevier. So I think we'll talk later in the program a little bit about some of the research results, but it's been a very good experience for us. And in scale, we have a lot of smaller read and publish agreements where we can get complete waivers on APCs. But as I said, the scale of our publishing with Elsevier just didn't make it possible to do something like that with you. And unless there's some follow-up you have, I think that sort of sets it up a little bit for the further conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Judy. And I would like to open that to the rest of our panel if anyone would like to add to that. Also ask how everyone is thinking about open access and the general research landscape, and if you're seeing or anticipating certain trends in the North American market.
Maybe I could throw in a couple of comments there. I'll say more about Carnegie Mellon's situation separately, but I think just to pick on a couple of points. The first is Gemma's observation about open access and open science. And I think many people now recognize that open access really is a subpart or a component of a broader shift towards open science. And when I talk with faculty on campus here and in other institutions, it's clear that open science has very much captured their minds. We've seen UNESCO in the last couple of weeks affirm their open science position. Inevitably, open access is going to get a lot of traction there. One thing that I get obsessed about, and maybe I shouldn't, and maybe you can talk me down from this. I've, as many of you know, been a Dean of Libraries in 4 different countries, touching each of the broad markets that you've talked about. And I think one of the shortcomings of many university approaches to open access is to think in terms of a regional market. Publishers operate in a global marketplace, and we need to take a holistic view of drivers and signals and intents across each of the parts of the world. For example, we know that Australia and New Zealand have been fairly innovative and early adopters of open data, open access type initiatives. What can we learn from their experiences that might play out in the US market? We know that many European countries have done tremendous work in developing pilot projects with Elsevier and other publishers, but they are able to do so because of national structures that we don't have in the United States. What can we discern from that? So I do think it's important for us, whilst of course paying attention to pricing and competitive landscapes in our local market, not to lose sight of the global environment. And to that, I would add the global environment of research funder mandates, which when I worked in publishing with one of Elsevier's big competitors, I used to say was the publisher's biggest salvation, because until there's a joined up approach by global research funders in terms of mandates and financial support, we will always be in a fragmented situation. More on that later, but I just couldn't resist your invitation, Lana.
I'm so glad you jumped in, Keith. Thank you for that. Yes, that global landscape absolutely is something to keep an eye to, and something we've also learned a great deal from as well in doing pilots in different parts of the world. Would anyone else like to add to that, either within their own institution or sort of those trends that we're seeing in the market?
I would just like to chime in and say, you know, coming from a much more, in some ways, under-resourced system where where our system is really primarily teaching focused, we have a lot of researchers and faculty members that aren't funded extramurally. So then how do we ensure that those individuals are able to promote their research, their work in a way that is on par with, you know, others who have a lot more resources, financial resources, to support those means. So I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about like the CSU example a little bit later, but I think what's been great about the open access pilot that we've experienced at CSU is the fact that a lot of researchers who don't have any funding are able to publish their works in an open manner, and to have individuals who could benefit from that research not be able to access that without a paywall, of course. So I think that is incredibly valuable to us.
Thanks, Emily. Any other thoughts on that before we continue on? All right. Well, Keith, I'm going to be coming back around to you. You do have the distinction of being our very first North America Open Access pilot partner. And as Gemma shared, in developing pilots, you know, we have learned that customers do have these very unique goals and approaches to OA, and have learned that one size does not fit all, as she described it. So tailoring does take time to really customize. It'd be great to hear from you what motivated CMU to pursue a transformative agreement, and if you also had some takeaways or learnings from that pilot development process.
Sure, I think, you know, the overarching theme from the CMU perspective is that we are anxious to maximize the share of Carnegie Mellon publications that are published under some form of open access. And just before we started this call, I checked on Dimensions and was able to see that in the current year, more than 60% of publications with a CMU author, corresponding or otherwise, are published open access. So we feel we've made considerable progress in recent years. Unlike the other universities represented on this call, we are not a comprehensive institution. We don't have a medical school or a law school. We're very heavily focused in computer science and in engineering. And that certainly skews our faculty's publishing patterns in a way that is different to a broadly comprehensive institution. And for good or for bad, Elsevier is not our top publisher. I think last time I checked, Elsevier was our third or fourth largest publisher, which is most unusual for a leading research university. And for that reason, Elsevier was an obvious partner for us to open conversations with, because on both sides, frankly, the stakes were lower than if we were dealing with our biggest publisher and you were dealing with one of your biggest customers. And it allowed, I believe, both parties to approach the negotiations with a degree of experimentation and an open mind. So that certainly was a critical point for us. And what we wanted to achieve was a sense of a transformative agreement, one where instead of thinking about payment flows for different functions, a bit of money for APCs, a bit of money for publishing, and a bit of money for readership, we wanted to think of scholarly communication as a single supply chain, and that we wanted to try and arrive at a model where we could think of this as a payment for a suite of services. And I believe that that is what we ended up with. Philosophically, I think it's important for institutions that are able to do so to think about this in the context of the longer term aim of open access, which is to maximize free and open readership of the world's research. Nobody is suggesting that we rip up all existing publishers' agreements and flip a switch overnight. But I think the critical piece of momentum is about retaining authors' rights, because it is through that mechanism that researchers are able to share, reuse, repurpose their work as they wish. And that is ultimately what lies behind the trajectory of open access, and therefore the agreements that we were able to negotiate with Elsevier and subsequently with some other publishers are really fostering that aim from our perspective. So I think I'll probably pause there, happy to take any follow-up questions, but that was really what sat behind our agreement. We're now coming towards the end of the second year. What has surprised us a little bit is a handful, not a dramatic number, but a handful of authors who have overtly elected not to take advantage of the open access opportunity, but to publish under a traditional license. Sometimes we've found people did so by mistake and they have changed that, but others have a particular and not very consistent view as to why they wish to pursue that traditional license.
Thanks so much, Keith. We've also had some interesting learnings along those lines. I'll give a teaser to one of the questions I'm going to ask Gemma a little later. She'll be touching a bit on some of our surprise learnings and takeaways as well, some things along those lines in terms of author behavior and adjusting how we're approaching it from there. Did anyone else want to add anything in terms of the pilot development process, or any learnings from that, or motivations for pursuing?
I actually had a follow-up question for Keith, if I may, Keith.
Absolutely.
You spoke there, I think, about how open access for you at Carnegie Mellon, I think you gave a couple of reasons around maximizing visibility and access to research. You talked about authors having the right to reuse their works. Is there, if it's possible, to rank them one single motivating factor for Carnegie Mellon around open access? And is there a Is there anything more that you might want to say about where open access fits into Carnegie Mellon's overall institutional strategy? Perhaps it's a goal in and of itself, or perhaps it signals something bigger.
So I've been at Carnegie Mellon 8.5 years, and in my time here, I've had the honor of working with two university presidents who both have been very committed, both as scholars in their own right and as institutional leaders, to allowing anyone to access the products of the university's scholarship freely, readily, easily. And they view this really as the university's obligation to the world. We believe at Carnegie Mellon, we are doing research that makes a difference, and we believe that that difference can be enhanced by free access, not only to publications, but to research data, to code and protocols, and to many of the other products of scholarship. Those who follow these things closely may have seen a recent announcement that we are opening next year the world's first academic cloud laboratory, which will accelerate the volume of data and protocols and code emerging from the research process. And we are very firmly of the view that, subject to any commercial or privacy constraints, we want all of that to be shareable. One of the biggest takeaways for me of the pandemic has been the impact of easy sharing of preprints, formally published works, data and other things in the quest for vaccines, treatments, other interventions in the race against COVID-19. And I've talked with a number of colleagues at CMU who say that has really opened their eyes to the benefit of the stuff that those of us in the open access world have been talking about for years. And they now firmly believe that we can't go back. So I think that has been an important takeaway. So I would say really that there is a strong institutional commitment to open access. I know we'll get to Q&A later, but just my eyes were attracted by one of the questions. And I would say that from my position as Dean of Libraries, it's not my role to tell a faculty member where they should publish. If they value a particular journal brand or a particular publisher relationship that they have, that is their absolute right. My role as Dean of Libraries in an institution that has firmly said, we believe in open access, is to make that possible for them in the least painful way. And where we see publishing output with publishers that run into hundreds of articles per annum, I believe that negotiated agreements with publishers is the way to go. Where it's the occasional article here and there, we look at APC support and other approaches.
Thank you so much, Keith. Any follow-ups on that? All right, wonderful. Now, Emily, I have one for you. I believe you've been involved in nearly every single monthly implementation meeting we've held from the beginning of our agreement. And to give our audience some insight into this, once we've developed an agreement, an institution selects one or several admins who guide implementation, make approvals in our systems, access the data resulting from agreements, and meet regularly with our implementation teams and me to review the data. We discuss any questions and, of course, gather feedback for both researchers and admins on our systems. So Emily, it would be great if you'd be open to sharing your experience with the implementation process and that ongoing engagement with the systems, data, and our teams.
Great, thank you, Lana. As I stated before, I work at San Jose State University, and it's one of 23 campuses within the larger California State University system. When we renewed our agreement with Elsevier and had this open access pilot as part of that 2-year agreement, there weren't any centralized resources at the consortium level to assist with implementation. So there were a couple of us who then kind of helped with the implementation and I guess education and training of all of the other individuals at the other 22 campuses. And so it was a really interesting prospect because we had to figure out things like how would we validate and authorize the APC requests. And we had to ensure that people were really communicating and marketing all of the auspices of this pilot program correctly to all of the faculty members at their individual campuses. And then taking all of that feedback into consideration, we brought concerns as well as questions back to the Elsevier's implementation team. So we've had monthly meetings. They've been, Elsevier's team has been incredibly responsive in terms of responding to questions that we had, even at an individual request level, but also to much larger concerns about things like what does it mean when we see a price box? So there was a lot of transparency that our users needed in terms of understanding what kinds of prices would be actually assessed at the end after with the APC waiver process. So with the CSU pilot, the actual APC is completely waived. You can see that on Elsevier's website with our pilot program. And so it was really important for our faculty members to see that as part of their author journey, that the article processing charge would be zeroed out if they elected to go with the CSU open access aspect. In addition, we've been able to bring a lot of questions about how we could improve the author journey process. And it's been very helpful for our librarians to see this process from another perspective, from that business perspective of and having those conversations with our faculty about versions of records, about what it means to be able to apply a Creative Commons license. All of those considerations have really enabled our librarians across the entire system to have, I think, much richer conversations than they've ever had with faculty researchers about the scholarly communications process. So it's been a really fruitful experience for us, not only in terms of understanding the author experience, but being able to have richer conversations about scholarly communications in general.
Thank you so much. There's so much great detail in that. And those are some of the interesting learnings we've had as well, Emily, in terms of the activity of the admins and how much of a difference that makes, the way we implement, and even the language we're showing to researchers. It really impacts the way they're engaging with the systems and the decisions they make. So there have been some surprises along the way for me as well in terms of things like that and the real importance of those elements. And certainly the collaboration and engaging with faculty, it just makes such a difference in terms of pilot success. So it's been a really interesting journey to go on with all of you. Judy, Keith, would you like to add anything about that? Any other components of that implementation process or any of the sort of ongoing engagement with teams or data?
I think we've found the engagement with your team also to be very productive and helpful. And we did start out with monthly meetings and then moved to quarterly meetings more recently because we found that things were smooth enough that we weren't needing that kind of constant attention. We found the administration of it to be very easy. Part of our goals and many of our agreements have been that it needs to be easily discerned and in fact almost transparent to the authors. They don't have to know about it to request it, that it's an automatic process for them and that it's a relatively light administrative burden for us. And I would say that's been true. The burden, to the extent you want to even use that term for it, has been the one we deliberately undertook, which was to do research with our authors, which we'll talk about, I think, a little later. But we found that we were all very attentive and responsive, particularly in those early months when we were getting our feet wet and trying to understand what was happening. We found the data sharing to be, very efficient and very helpful. I don't know that I have more to add there. You may have something to say.
I would only add, likewise, I think the relationship and the progress has been very good. I think the tougher part for us has been simply getting the word out on campus. And particularly as more and more of these agreements fall into place, people begin to tune out and they don't necessarily follow our updates as closely as we would wish. I think one issue tied into that has surfaced has been helping our faculty understand the precise qualification arrangements. And we've had a few issues, not just with our Elsevier agreement of somebody has finished their PhD, they've taken their first faculty role at another university, they're publishing their PhD work, they're the corresponding author, and are surprised that the article is not covered by the agreement because they are corresponding from their new institution. And that is one flavor of a broader concept that Gemma introduced me to a few weeks ago around author tourism. And it is something that we're paying attention to, the notion that the logical corresponding author may not necessarily be the corresponding author as people become aware of which institutions have agreements and how best to line things up to take advantage of those. And whilst some people might say that's a nice Robin Hood type situation, that can begin to interfere with some of the modeling that both the customer and the publisher have put in place to arrive at pricing and other arrangements. So it's just something we keep an eye on, but hasn't particularly been an issue with Elsevier.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's really very interesting insight. And Judy, you actually kind of queued us up for the next question here, because something we also have really valued in our partnership has been that sharing of data and insights. And you have done really interesting surveying of your researchers to gain that better understanding of what informs their publishing choices, sort of one of our key goals in doing these pilots as well. Is there anything resulting from that work that you found particularly surprising, interesting, or enlightening in terms of informing policies or future decisions around open access?
I think some of the things we found would be sort of the easy, obvious things that we might have all anticipated, but there have been some interesting findings. Just so the audience knows, we take the list of publications each month and we send a survey to authors who didn't take advantage of the discount and chose to stay with the subscription model, and have a survey for them about why their choices were made. And then we have a separate survey that goes to the authors who have chosen open access. And the things that I think you would not find surprising are that the three top reasons that are given for why people did not use the APC discount were that the amount of the APCs were still too expensive for the resources they had available, and that they didn't have funding at all for APCs, or that authors should not have to pay for their research to be published, which was interesting and yet came up repetitively. I think the things that have been a little more surprising is that even among the authors who chose the subscription method and didn't take advantage of the discount, most of them had already in their careers published 2 or more open access articles. So they weren't not doing it because they didn't want to do open access or didn't understand or value open access. We even had some authors, and we're planning a focus group with them to dig a little deeper into it, but who had during the course of the pilot published 1 or more articles open access and 1 or more subscription. so that their behavior wasn't consistent even for that one author. And it does seem to deal a lot with the availability of funding at the moment when they're submitting the article. So I know this has come up other times. They may have funding during a grant, and if so, there's an article that's published that's the intermediate research. There may be grant funding that supports it, but by the time the culminating article is written that finalizes their research results, generally the grant has expired and there isn't that source of funding. Or they may have enough funding available to cover an APC for one article during a certain period of time, but not to do two or more. So we are trying to learn more about their behavior, and we've looked at our university, and it's a very large and complex university, and felt that there really wasn't any way for us to aggregate all the various sources of funding that are being used by our authors to pay APCs. So we specifically looked at a model where we were sort of leaving that in place and relying on what resources they had, either from development funds or grants or discretionary funds within their departments. And that's one of the things we've been trying to understand better with them, is how they're making the decision and what are the influencers. But price seems to be the one that comes up. And again, I don't think any of us would be surprised. I'm impressed that Keith's saying that they've gotten such a high percentage of their authors using open access. I'd love to see that happen with ours. But again, I think it's as much a resource issue as it is a policy issue or a specific decision not to do open access. It's more about, do they have the money to do it? I think they all like the idea that they'll get higher citations, higher usage of their research if it's in open access venues. And so that's something that attracts them to doing it, and they acknowledge that, but it's then offset by who's paying the bill. And as I said before, our volume of publishing with Elsevier is so high that there was no way for us to centralize that cost in the library and absorb it in our budget. So are there other things you think of when you think of the research we've shared that maybe I didn't address that you would like to bring out, Lana?
I think you hit on the key ones. So I'll give that a thought. It looked like Keith unmuted. Did you want to add to that, Keith?
Well, Judy's account is absolutely spot on and points to, in part, to the comment I made earlier about the fragmented nature of university and research activity in the United States compared to a more holistic system like that in the UK, for example, where a body like JISC could pool together different approaches to support a more comprehensive agreement. And I remember when the open access report came out in 2012 in the UK, the government signaled this is the beginning of a transition through which we expect funding agencies and universities to transition funds from library subscriptions to open access publishing. Now that was a very flawed report for a variety of reasons, but the sentiment is absolutely right. And I think the biggest challenge that I can't see how we figure out easily is the comparative distribution of cost burden when we compare readership and authorship. I don't know how many customers Elsevier has in the United States, but it's probably something in the 2,000 to 4,000 mark. And those 2,000 to 4,000 customers, I may be way off, but stick with me, are contributing a share of Elsevier's revenue. The publishing by US institutions is probably heavily skewed towards 50 to 100 universities. If all else being equal, you try to transition the costs from readership to authorship at a system level, you are asking those 50 to 100 universities to find the money to cover the subscription costs borne by 2,000 to 4,000 reading institutions. And it just doesn't work out. Some people point to some universities, typically prestigious private ones, as having lots of money, but they don't. At least the libraries don't. And few universities are so philanthropic that they would be willing to bear the costs of the whole system. And I just can't figure out how we sustain that unless we have something like a subscribe to open model that doesn't have too many free riders, and I'm skeptical there at a time of budget crunch. And that's why I think it's tremendously important and a very positive signal that Elsevier is helping the community work with a number of different types of pilots so that we can all try to learn lessons about what works, what doesn't. But there is a much bigger question that US research and higher education has to answer about a national level commitment to open access. And I'm not sure there are many votes in open access, and therefore I don't feel desperately optimistic, but I would like to.
I think that's true. I think we're, sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
I think that's what we're seeing too. I mean, even when the Office of Science and Technology Policy first introduced this idea of the deposit mandates, there was a sense of that being unfunded mandates, both for the agencies and for the researchers and the institutions that support them. The model was not mature, that it wasn't bringing new money in to cover those costs. It was, our researchers expressed concern that it was actually going to take dollars away from research that would go into the infrastructure for the open access part. So I do think Keith is very right. And I do think that's one of the things that I found interesting in working with Elsevier is this openness to trying different models and learning from those models. I think we talked earlier about one size doesn't fit all, and it doesn't fit all. I mean, we're several quite different institutions here, Carnegie Mellon as an individual institution and the California state system as a group of institutions. UF is also individual, but a very, very large comprehensive research university. So it's very hard in the US without something that they have in many of the European countries that centralizes this more to try to find a single model that's going to apply broadly. And I think his point about how much of the publishing is coming from a rather concentrated group of institutions compared to the groups that are supporting through the subscriptions is a part of the challenge that we all face together. So it'll be interesting to see how over time pilots help inform and also in our own institutional policies.
Right. And one of the things that I just wanted to add to what Keith just said is that really resonated because as the California State University system, we're primarily a readership consortium. And when, I think Judy, you said there were about 8,000 articles that UF published last year. I think across our whole system, it was probably about 400 with Elsevier across 23 campuses. So that just speaks to the scope of where we're at as a publishing entity. And so how does an open access pilot help to accommodate all of the different needs of each institution and group? And I think that our faculty aren't unique in wanting to have the widest readership for their work and to have, potentially higher discoverability and citation counts. So the researchers are going to have fairly similar aims, but the institutions are going to have very different means by which they can achieve those aims.
Well, this has actually teed up our next question perfectly. This one's for Gemma. One of the reasons we are taking this test and learn approach that we're all talking about here is to gather more information and insights in terms of what is working, what isn't, and also taking into consideration these different types of institutions and different needs. So this, I think, all reflects back to the mutual challenges we're really working together to overcome. So I'd love for you to speak to that and some of our learnings so far, and if any of those outcomes have been particularly interesting or surprising for building off of this great conversation.
Sure, thank you, Lana. And perhaps unsurprisingly, you'll hear that our learnings and observations very much echo what you've heard from our panelists. I promise we didn't compare notes. I think it just goes to show that we're all seeing similar things, which is important. First of all, around author choice, I think, Keith, you touched on this, how authors behave, the choices they make around open access versus subscription. It's certainly something we need to improve our understanding of. It's been interesting to observe, I think, maybe to your point, Emily, or Keith, your colleague on the chat, the wording that we use, the clarity that we provide authors with about their options is really important. Also, what's really important is how much the institution drives and dedicates resource and focus to open access. That makes a huge difference in many of our agreements. I think there are also differences in global attitudes. Keith, you were talking about this importance of authors enabling others to reuse their works. We actually see real differences in the license choices that authors make if they're based in Europe versus North America, for example. North American authors much more reticent about granting broader commercial reuse rights, the CC-BY license, for example, versus mature Europe, where there's much bigger, stronger drive from the funder or the librarian around that. Administration also, Emily, I think you summed it up perfectly, the nuances and complexities that we could never have anticipated or imagined and are still learning as we go through these pilots, how we get the data right, how we get the workflows right, the systems, the dashboards, everything that goes into making the agreement a success, and the partnership that requires from both sides. I think an important element that's not surprising to us, but that may surprise some and is a nice segue into again, that structural challenge Keith was mentioning, is the element that's remained constant, that subscribing, that reading still has value. I mentioned earlier our open access volume growth, which is extraordinary, but the point that often gets missed is our continued subscription article volume and quality growth as well. This puts us in a unique position relative to other publishers, but it's a helpful context as we look to those shared challenges. So if we elevate that up, I think there's probably two broader challenges we need to continue to work through. The first is the progress of open access and people's expectations around a transition. That really has to be looked at and understood in the context of the choices that authors are making. And there's a really interesting debate about how much authors should be told where and how to publish. Keith, you were very clear, you don't see that as your role. Others very much do, and that's an ongoing debate I think that we'll continue to have. And the other is this issue of funding flows. 80% of articles are published by 20% of institutions. So if we think about a future in which research-intensive institutions will pay more, relatively speaking, because they publish more, but more reading or education-focused institutions pay less, how do we get there? That's the difficult part, especially when reading or subscribing continues to have value today. And then you layer on top of that the diverse priorities that we talked about earlier. Some institutions more focused on budget, some focused on OA, others looking at open science. Really for us, that's why we're doing these pilots, to see what we can learn and how we can evolve and get closer to our customers and work through those challenges together. But I do think while we have learned a ton and will continue to do so, and no doubt have many more pilots, we don't have all of the answers today. But we'll continue working on those step by step with some of our pilot agreement partners.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gemma. And Judy, continue.
I was just going to say that one of the things that we've tried to do unsuccessfully at UF is to try to identify how much UF is actually spending on APCs, to sort of compare that with the expenditures that are in the library budget. And we know that they are spending millions of several $1 million at least, but it's just very hard to track it through the budget process because so many different people are paying with so many different sources of fundings. And so, you know, there are counting codes they're supposed to be using to indicate an expenditure like an APC, but those codes can be used for things that aren't APCs as well as things that are, and then APCs can be charged against other codes incorrectly. But we know that there's an enormous investment, not just in our licenses that the libraries pay, but in the APC. So the universities are contributing to both parts of that equation. They are contributing to the publishing costs directly through the open access fees, and they're also contributing through our subscription fees. I don't know where that equilibrium is or how we ever reach it, but I think that's an area that we would certainly like to know more about, of really trying to better understand how much money the university is spending in total. So I imagine others have that same question about, it's just kind of hard to track all those sources of funds and really know how much is being spent.
We had exactly the same question here, and ultimately the answer came as best it could from our finance department. We had them run transaction reports for payments to Elsevier and others, and it took a lot of wading through, but we got a best guess. But we are relatively small, so it's somewhat more manageable. I did want to make a couple of observations in response to Gemma's points about the 80-20, 20-80. The first is ensuring that what I broadly describe as the global south is not left behind in all of this. I made the point earlier about this being a global enterprise, and we know that publishers have been supportive of the global south in terms of access to content for many years, and we need to ensure that APC waivers or other support mechanisms are put in place to allow the important voices from the global south to be heard in an open access format and not defaulting to a traditional publishing license just because they don't have access to transformative agreements or APC funds or other mechanisms. The other point I would make is about China and trying to track and understand what is happening. As we know, over the last couple of years, we've heard reports of Chinese authors being directed in somewhat different publishing outlets than was the case until 2019, and understanding the impact of that on a global open access model or economy is something that I think we shouldn't lose sight of.
And if I may, a follow-up question for Judy, Keith, Emily, you as well, of course, on this issue, Judy, of trying to understand researchers' spend on open access and bring together all of the different funding flows within the library. I know it's something that many of our customers have struggled with, and there are some customers I can actually connect you with that might be able to help with some of that, particularly in Austria. But one thing I'm interested in your view on is how you see the role of funders, because obviously a lot of that funding for APCs is from grant funding sources. I'm just interested in your perspective of how you view that. Do you see that as part of the institution's expenditure? Is it funder expenditure? Where do grants play a role in the open access space? Obviously, it's a very live discussion in Europe, and there's a strong view there, but I'm really interested in your view.
That's probably a whole additional seminar, but I think for us, as I say, there's a real perception that the grant funding is a part of it, but not the dominant part of it, both because of the fact that so much publishing is done after the grant has ended, but also just because the way funding is managed in grants, and other expenses come up, and so money that might have been intended to be used for open access fees is gone before the publications are taking place. So I do think that there is definitely a view that, to the extent that that was more rigid, that there was money in the grant for APCs, that would give less flexibility to the researchers, and it would be seen as taking money away from the research. Not that they don't value the publishing. I mean, they obviously do. That's why they write and publish as much as they do. But they become competing interests. If the grant were going to be increased by some percentage to allow money for APCs, that would be different. But if it's the same net amount of money that's coming, it's then viewed as actually potentially reducing the money that's available to do the research. It's a very complicated issue and varies from funding source to funding source, obviously.
So on that very large, complex topic, I realize unbelievably we have used up our hour, and perhaps there are opportunities to have additional discussions on some of what we touched on today, because you're right, Judy, there's so much to unpack and discuss here. But I did want to say it's been so rewarding working with you all and learning in this space together. I want to thank you again for joining us today, and also for the audience for taking the time. And I believe, Sabrina, you wanted to close us out today.
Yeah, this is Sabrina from Choice and ACRL. Thank you so much to our presenters for taking the time to present today, and thanks to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we'd really appreciate it. Your responses help improve our presentations. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something from the webinar, and we hope to see you again on another program.